and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener, who is flying solo today because Gareth is apparently away this evening earning an honest wage. So it's just me tonight. But in this podcast, more generally, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer, who obviously isn't here tonight, so we'll have to substitute him in a second for someone, and a product manager from the world of business as we compare and contrast our experiences and attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And today I am very pleased to say we have another guest on the podcast. Robert O'Connor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. It's an honor. I will say, though, having to follow the episode with Colonel Oliver Lee, OBE, this is a little bit of from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Well, you see, you might say that. I would argue, I would disagree with you strongly, because what's made this podcast so interesting for us is it's the diverse experiences and opinions and ideas that we think is really interesting. And in fact, to your point, I think you're talking about an episode we did a couple of weeks ago with Oliver Lee. Actually, he talks a lot about diverse ideas and diversity. So I think we are living experience, but also glad you enjoyed that episode. And if other people haven't heard it, please do.
Very good episode.
So Robert is a writer who lives in Memphis, Tennessee. I think you probably guessed from his accent, he's not from Oxfordshire. His father was a World War II veteran, which I think you'll hear echoes of that a little bit later. But he instilled a love of reading, and his mother gave him a love of sports, which we'll come on to. For our American listeners, Robert was a diehard Yankees fan in his youth. Go Yankees, as I believe Americans are wont to say. But apparently, it says here, he lost his interest after they regained their winning ways, which sounds like a true sportsman. But not to be left out for our English listeners, our UK listeners, it literally says here in my notes that were written, in fact, I have to admit, were stolen from somewhere else. It says, strangely, he is a supporter of Wigan Athletic, which is described here as a third-tier English football club. And I think you would have a number of Brits who would even raise an eyebrow at third-tier English football club. But maybe we have to touch on that a minute, Robert, to find out why your love of English football clubs. But it also talks how you've gone through a Winston Churchill phase, including cigars, which is not in itself a bad phase, but also perhaps gives a hint of his historical interest. But I think for your sins, you were a marketing executive at Procter & Gamble, and then following on a co-owner of an advertising agency. So listeners might be wondering, who have not heard of Robert before, why battling with business? That seems sort of an obscure background for a battling with business. Well, I think the bit that brings Robert to us today is his first book was a non-fiction book called Gumption Aid, a booster for your self-improvement plan. And his most recent book, and we're going to touch on that today, was something called Jeep Tour. And they are two very different books, but in their ways, they're all about morale and the stories that go with it. So Robert, as you said already, I guess I've sort of got there early. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for coming to talk a bit about Jeep Tour and morale.
My pleasure.
So let's maybe start at the beginning. And in fact, we'll talk about Jeep Tour in a second, and we'll talk about the historical context. Bit of a cheat question. Listeners to the podcast will know myself and Gareth actually have plenty of interest in history, and particularly World War II history. I've just mentioned that your father was in World War II. Tell me a little bit about your father and whether or not, I have to assume it probably has, how that shaped your interest.
Well, my dad enlisted in the United States Army at age 19. His younger brother, my Uncle George, enlisted in the Navy at age 17. He lied about his age. My father traveled to Scotland, actually, on the Queen Mary troop ship. There's a chapter in Jeep Show where the protagonist travels to Scotland on the Queen Mary troop ship. So my father got over to Britain on the Queen Mary. He was training to be a pilot. He was washed out of the program due to nearsightedness, and he spent most of the war in Liverpool, essentially in logistics in Liverpool. So, and he never talked about his experiences in the war. I, at the time, while he was still alive, I had no idea that I was going to write a novel about World War II. So I didn't ask him. My Uncle George, who was in combat in the Pacific in the Navy, also never talked about it. Towards the end of his life, he told me a few things. So my interest in the subject of Jeep shows and the Battle of the Bulge came actually from a person that I discovered. I was going to write a second nonfiction book, and I was going to write it about the circus. And I had the name of a specific circus promoter that I was interested in understanding his career. I managed to reach his daughter, and she told me about his career in the American circus and as a circus promoter. And she said, by the way, my father, you probably don't know this, but my father was an enlisted entertainer in World War II, military occupation specialty 442. He and other 442s did Jeep shows, which were three entertainment specialists, enlisted men, would get in a Jeep, drive to just behind the front lines, and jump out and do essentially a vaudeville type small show for combat infantry that had been brought back a mile or half a mile to get a hot meal and perhaps a uniform exchange. And I said, no, I did not know. I did not know there were enlisted entertainers in World War II. And she said, yes, they were sent to places where the USO, and for your listeners, we might say ENSA, ENSA, every night something awful, by the way, was the Tommy's funny, loving tribute. But they were sent to places where the USO could not go. And because they were under orders as enlisted soldiers, they had to go to places where the USO could not go. And she told me, and by the way, my father's squad leader in his three-man squad was Mickey Rooney. Now, some of your older listeners will know that Mickey Rooney was the #1 worldwide box office star of 1939 and a giant Hollywood star who joined the Army, could have done his service, could have done, admirable service in Hollywood doing films for the Army Signal Corps, as Lieutenant Ronald Reagan did. But for some reason, and I have my suspicions as to why, Mickey Rooney decided that he would jump all the way in and go over to Europe and be a morale corps soldier. So once I found out about the life of this real person who had been in the morale corps and had done Jeep shows, I decided I wanted to write about that. As it happened, this soldier's older sister saved every letter he wrote home from training camp and from the European theater of operations. So I had, 100 some odd letters, primary source material. And then, Chris, in the endless internet, I found the 1944 U.S. Army manual for the morale corps with, explicit instructions of what microphone they were supposed to take with them to hook up to the Jeep's battery, and what equipment they would have and how they would do it, and something that comes in the book later, how they were never to do anything that would embarrass the officers during their shows, which was ignored a time or two, thankfully. So I had primary source material, and I wanted to involve, as we were talking earlier, when you're writing historical fiction, it's important to be very accurate about the big picture things, the actual events, when they happened, how they happened. If you are very accurate with that, you can take your protagonist and you can involve him in lots of different things that you just make up. And so this protagonist, I wanted him to be involved in the Battle of the Bulge, which is the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. And as you well know, a pivotal battle in Western Europe towards the end of the war. And so I decided to write fiction, and thus I was able to put him in situations like the defense of Bastogne, the liberation of a concentration camp, the occupied Germany in 1945 and 1946. So that's how I came to write it. It wasn't inspired by my father's service, that is inspiring to me, but it was more, I found out about something that apparently nobody knows about.
It was I mean, it was a real surprise to me. And then, of course, as I read through the book, it became less and less of a surprise to me. So you talked a little bit about Enser, and again, it
Yeah,
depends how much you know about the British military. But
right.
again, you using the phrase you used for the older members of the listeners who might remember when they were very young, the TV program "It Ain't Half Hot, Mum." It is a group. It is a group of entertainers sent to entertain the troops, and we'll come back to this idea, I think, a little bit later
Yeah,
about the importance and delivery of morale. But there's a couple of things I just want to dive into
sure,
now because I think it's
sure.
fascinating. The first one, which I absolutely love, and it touches. What's great about these conversations is you never know the resonance that they'll have with modern day, whether it be business or
Mhm.
military. But you've already tickled my fancy, and I do remember you sort of lead a lot of the chapters with this, which is your
Yeah.
point about the fact there is a manual for how you go about
Right,
entertaining people.
right.
And in fact, I think you actually offer references not just from that manual, but from other manuals
Yes,
that the
yes,
US military.
yes,
This idea that number one, there are categories of soldiers, the 442s, for specific kinds of entertainment, because I
right.
think there's other codes you talk about for other kinds of
Yes,
entertainment.
yes, yes,
That's fascinating in an organization. And it again, it'll lead us back to this idea of the importance of morale.
yes.
I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And I mean, obviously, in the book, you use them as points of humor almost, because they
Right.
almost seem ridiculous that
Absurd.
there is a
Yes,
manual.
yes, yes.
And yet, of course, when you are moving millions of people in a
Yeah,
military situation, actually, of course, you need a manual
right,
on how to do this entertainment so
right,
you do it in the right
right.
way. A different thing, and we'll move towards the morale question. But I'm fascinated. Your main protagonist, Jim, in the book, who, as you say, comes over on the Queen Mary, has a bit of a history as an entertainer before he joins the military,
Yes,
little bit older, volunteers rather than is drafted, I believe,
yes, correct.
comes over and is involved in the Jeep Tour, and as you say, and we'll touch on this a little bit more later as well, is sort of involved in the Battle of the Bulge and these other things. But the point about Mickey Rooney, I think, is a really interesting one. Now, as a vehicle in a novel, obviously, it's a fantastic opportunity to
Right,
sort of
right.
put your hero in different places. But you sort of said, I can guess why Mickey Rooney wanted to do this. Why? The idea that a very famous film star, a highly valuable film star, would be I think he was an enlisted
Yeah.
private.
Well, he
Why?
ended the war as a corporal. Well, a couple of things. One was that by late 1943, he and other men, celebrities his age, were feeling a lot of pressure to join the military. But my suspicion is, and this is an original thought to me, um, is I just have to step back. Mickey Rooney was an absolute genius. Several directors he worked with said he was the most talented actor they had ever directed. He played the drums at a professional level. He was an incredibly funny slapstick stand-up comedian. He was great with impressions. There was literally nothing in entertainment that Mickey Rooney could not do. As you know, and as most of your audience knows, Chris, where there are great strengths, there are corresponding great weaknesses. And Mickey Rooney's great weaknesses was when he wasn't working, his life was one gigantic nonstop party. And I mean, he was married to Rita Hayworth, the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, and he cheated on her repeatedly. Um, he he and his posse would invade other movie sets and just have a great time. My suspicion is, and maybe this comes from reflecting on my own life, but my suspicion is he saw the chance to get into the war in Europe as a chance to get away from the Hollywood lifestyle he was living before it killed him.
It's fast. I mean, I'm going to use the word mission a little bit later
Yeah.
on because I think that the word mission overlaps Jeep Tour,
Hmm.
but it also becomes really important. I think you tell this story really well about then what happens at the Battle of the Bulge. I wonder whether there was a sense of mission for Mickey Rooney as well, on the basis that presumably he could have said, I'm going to join up, but I'm going to go sit in a nice,
Right.
comfortable
Yeah.
studio
Yeah.
somewhere
Yeah.
in Paris or in London. And yet, and how close did he get to the front line? I mean, literally, he was on a Jeep tour. He literally went
Right.
a couple of miles behind the front line.
These Jeep shows went as far as a half a mile behind the front, and in fact, sometimes they got caught nearer the front. So he was in artillery range and sniper range in some of these shows. So he was literally doing frontline duty. Yeah, that he could have done his service at Hal Roach Studios, which was 10 minutes from his house in Beverly Hills, and instead he chose to get over to Europe and jump in with both feet, or as I think you say in England, get stuck in.
I think he certainly got stuck in. So let's actually, why don't you tell us a bit more about your protagonist and
Sure.
some of his sort of experiences, maybe in the run up to the Battle of the Bulge and what he's doing? Because I think that starts to put a bit more color on what a
Sure.
Jeep tour actually is. And perhaps as we edge towards this idea of morale, why was it so important and what did it
Yes.
achieve?
Yes, I really want to get to that. Despite a fatherhood deferment, 30-year-old dance instructor Jim Tanzer enlists in the American Army in 1943. Stella, his wife and partner in their dance act, regrets his choice. The book has flashbacks to Jim's childhood, his time in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Uh, the Civilian Conservation Corps was a program during the American Depression in the 30s for young men to go and work in faraway places and earn money to send home. A bit like the military. So he did time in the Civilian Conservation Corps. He did a hitch as a circus clown, and then we see his difficulties trying to make it in show business in New York in the late 1930s. After he enlists, Jim goes for paratrooper, but gets assigned to the Morale Corps because of his show business background. He's classified MOS 442, entertainment specialist, and MOS in the American Army is military occupation specialty. After training camps, Private Jim Tanzer is shipped to the European Theater of Operations and assigned to Jeep shows. 3 enlisted entertainers are driven to the front lines where they put on small variety shows for combat infantry. Private Mickey Rooney leads Jim's squad. Now, as you know, Chris, from reading the book, um, that squad is doing a typical Jeep show on the German border on December 5th, the evening of December 15th, at a little town in Luxembourg called Hosingen. After the show, as it happens, they need to evacuate a wounded American soldier, and Jim gets left behind the night of the 15th, December 15th, to catch the normal supply bus the next morning. The next morning is December 16th, which was the first day of the Battle of the Bulge. So we follow. Jim makes kind of, I guess, what I would call a fighting slash stumbling retreat, and his retreat follows as you know, there was about a 95-mile front that the Germans attacked. They attacked with 3 armies, basically one in the north, one in the south, and one in the middle. The one in the middle, a Panzer army, made significant progress for several days, and thus the American press called it the Bulge in the American line, and thus the Battle of the Bulge is really describing what happened right in the middle of the line. Well, that's where Jim Tanzer, the protagonist, is. And as he retreats, and there are battles and more retreats along the way. And those are historically accurate with delaying actions that the American Army fought in the middle of the lines there. And then he ends up in Bastogne. And he is, as were all I'll call them orphan soldiers, the infantrymen from companies that had been overrun, rear echelon soldiers, mechanics, telephone operators, cooks, barbers, and then this one lost entertainment soldier, and they get rounded up and turned into a fighting unit called Team Snafu. Snafu in the American Army parlance is situation normal, all effed up. And Team Snafu actually existed in the Bulge and played a very important supporting role to what the unit that in America is quite famous, the 101st Airborne Infantry, which was central to the defense of Bastogne. So he gets involved with a lot of these things, and the story of morale is, as it involves, is both the type of soldiering he was doing, the Jeep shows, and then his own observation of the way that these infantry soldiers under pressure maintain their morale in very difficult circumstances, and how he himself is able to maintain his morale to do, at the very least, an adequate job of soldiering along the way.
I mean, obviously, we talk about the protagonist in the book, Jim, and it's based on some of these letters.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated. What were the insights you got about the morale of his time in the Jeep show, and some of the things that I think we take for granted? So the fact that you've talked about letters, and in the book there are various letters that are written, I think we take that for granted now. But talk to me about what you got from those letters. Right. What did you sort of learn about what they thought and how they thought about stuff?
Well, I think the most important thing that I learned from the letters and from reading soldiers' interviews and accounts, and actually reading an account by a man who was an entertainer in ENSA, in the British version of the Morale Corps, was that the show was important, that these entertainment soldiers had come to the front. They weren't in the rear echelon with the USO and the supply officers and in the comfort of Paris or Brussels. So the combat infantry at the front recognized, first of all, that these soldiers had come to the danger zone, and then that the show was important, but was more important was them spending time, taking the time to recognize. I kind of lifted from an interview of an ENSA soldier a point he made. He was talking to the protagonist, and he says, and I will not attempt my British accent because it would be ludicrous, but he says, I did a 7-month tour of Africa in 42. You saw me tonight. I'm not but a poor man's George Formby. But imagine you're a 19-year-old Tommy from Lancashire, never been farther than Blackpool for a donkey ride. Him and his mates are guarding an oil field in Libya, 1,000 miles from home. Mail and rations delivered once a week, 120 degrees at noon, sand fleas, bath once a month, can't even get Lord Haw Haw on the wireless. Well, you're tough to see anyone from England, aren't you? And then he goes on to say, my act is half pie. I'm no name and never will be. Don't have the gifts. But the thing is, mate, and here's what I'd like to, the main message. Morale is the showing up, the being there. The performance, sure, but also the natter over tea and a biscuit, letting the lads know they're not forgotten, like letters from home. That I can do. So, if you're in the American 28th Division, and you've been, first of all, you survived the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, of just an awful, miserable experience, and you're on the border of Germany a few weeks later, and you 3 performers jump out of a Jeep and do a performance. Well, if one of them is Mickey goddamn Rooney, you get an incredible show, because you're, unlike the USO show where all the officers, hog all the good seats, you're sitting on the ground 6 feet away from Mickey Rooney. But again, I want to emphasize it's the being there. And when I have thought about in my own life, and I think this is true for all of us, if we are going through a really hard time, and to be a combat infantryman in the Ardennes in December of 1944 is a very hard time. very dangerous, extremely uncomfortable, and they felt very isolated. Uh, if you feel that way, the best thing your mates can do for you is to just be present for you. We don't, let's say our friend loses a parent or is in a divorce or, something terrible happens. He doesn't need us to show up and give him the solution to all his problems. What he needs is us to show up and be present. Let's play some cards. Let's go down to the pub. Let's just talk. And that was the most important thing about the ENSA shows, I believe, at the front lines, and about the Jeep shows by the Morale Corps. I will also tell you, and the fundamental point of what maintained morale for the American combat soldiers, and certainly for the British, and frankly also for the German combat soldiers, was in the end, you're not fighting for democracy, you're not fighting to free people. You're doing that, but that in the end, you're fighting for your buddies, or in Britain, you'd say for your mates. And so often, with soldiers in all armies, when they are light wounded enough that they have to, go to the rear and be hospitalized or be treated, they can't get back to their units fast enough. And the reason they can't get back to their units fast enough is they're in it for their buddies, and their buddies are in it for them. And that is the fundamental point that I took away of morale. And, if we generalize to all life, not just military, but civilians, we're in this for each other. And, the way we maintain morale for each other is to be present and to be in it for each other.
That is, as with my favorite conversations on these podcasts, it's some of the most simple concepts that are actually the most wonderful, which is the concept that people who have been, and particularly in the case of the Battle of the Bulge, I mean, we're mixing fact and fiction, but the fact of many of the people in the Battle of the Bulge have been fighting across Europe. Many of them were new, scared.
Right.
They were living in snow. And this is one of the things, having seen the film The Battle of the Bulge, apparently it was a sunny day. Of course, it was not. It was deep snow when they were doing this. The idea that under that kind of stress and threat and life, three people turning up in a Jeep making, as you say in the book, stupid jokes.
Right.
They're terrible jokes. It is, I mean, what you expect with three men in a Jeep to some degree,
Right.
but that has an impact, I think. And you said it so well, and I think the magic word which was showing up. So I work in an environment which sometimes can be stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And we, as a leadership team, we often talk about how do we support our teams. And I think sometimes there is an assumption that supporting people is a complex thing, that you have to incentivize people or do some clever things or come up with an amazing mission. But there were two things you've nailed, which I think are true today in any business, and obviously exemplified in the military, was that number one is showing up. Number one is literally saying, we have not forgotten you.
Right.
And whether you are three people on a Jeep, or whether you are a manager or a leader who turns up in the coffee room and says, hey guys, how's it going? Or whether you're in the middle of the Ardennes in the cold, showing up is an enormously transferable point. And the second one is the importance of understanding why people do the things they do. And in our various episodes, we've talked about mission, we've talked about culture, we've talked about many, let's call them grand ideas, all of which have merit. If you can give people a worthwhile mission, then that really helps. But I think you have reminded us of something that's really important, which is whether you're in the Hürtgen forest or on the edge of Bastogne with lots of German tanks coming towards you, or you are in my world, a scrum team delivering software or whatever it might be, there's a whopping great dollop of doing it for the people who are around you, the friends you have at work,
Absolutely.
the people you are close to. So I love that it would be easy to argue what is the relevance of Jeep shows today,
Yeah.
but actually I think conceptually it's incredibly important in terms of talking about what we have today. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because you run an ad agency, you've worked in
Right.
large organizations. Was there this connection as you were thinking about morale? And obviously you've written another book on it as well. How have you sort of connected those things from what you wrote about in Jeep Show with actually what you've experienced in terms of teams you've worked with or teams you've grown as well?
Well, I think one of the things I reflect upon is when I was running an agency and with people reporting to me, you keep an eye on what people are doing and and without telling them what to do, you keep an eye on what they're doing. And one of the things I realized is extremely conscientious, self-driven, self-motivated people, which is what you want, can be very hard on themselves and can try to do too much too quickly. And what I found is you could almost, if you sat down with one of the managers, they would almost be red in the face and have shallow breathing as they talked about the project list, the work list, the to-dos. And what I found is this worked very reliably again, part of it, Chris, as you say, is just being present and listening. You listen to the issues and then you just say, let's take them in order. Hey, Bill, you did a great job of talking me through all the stuff you're choking on. Let's take them in order. What's the first thing? What's the second thing? What's the third thing? Okay, let's go do the first thing. And you could see Bill, you could see his face would not be, his face would get unread. His breathing would get more normal. It's as we say, it's the being there and without telling somebody what to do, it's just talking them through the process when they've become overwhelmed. And it's always when you become overwhelmed, it's always helpful if you can stop and just say, well, what's the most important thing? Okay, I'll do that. And once you get busy doing that, you feel a lot better about everything else. So that's probably the biggest lesson. I was, frankly, Chris, I was a terrible manager and a terrible leader. And I just had to eventually stop doing both of those things. I probably learned more to help me with these books from my mistakes than from my successes.
Well, welcome to this podcast, which is why we do exactly the same thing here.
Right, right. All the learnings are in failure is one of my sayings. I do want to say I had one thing prepared for Gareth Tennant that relates to motivation in a military situation, and I became fascinated with the subject of sergeant majors in the British Army. And then as I researched Jeep Show, I learned the huge role that sergeants played in combat effectiveness. Basically, the enlisted men, the private and the corporals, of course, they listened to their officers and lieutenants, but after they got an order from their lieutenant, or they would then turn to their sergeant to see what they were supposed to do. There's a character which no one has asked me about in the interviews I've done in the book, and I've been very disappointed because he's other than the protagonist and Mickey Rooney, he's my favorite character in the book. When the protagonist is walking through Regent's Park in London on his way to the European Theatre of Operations, and he's actually going to the theater that night. And he's by a statue of Peter Pan. And of course, there was great subtle meaning in, the fact that there's a statue of Peter Pan there, but we won't go into that. And he runs into a very old man wearing an unusual blue uniform.
Hang on, no, I'm not going to let you get away with this. So I'm not going to spoil the story, but he is an old soldier. And interesting question, did they wear blue jackets then?
The Chelsea pensioners in 1944 navy blue double-breasted frock coat and a shako of the same color with the letters RH embroidered on it. So apparently they weren't wearing red, or my
I was going to say
sources.
that's what I was going to say. So
Right.
this is, and by the way, I'm doing just enough to prove to Robert that I actually do remember this. And actually, I think it's fascinating because what struck me, again, I'm probably doing this more just to
Yeah.
prove to Robert, this was one of those unexpected meetings with an old soldier, but it wasn't an old soldier from the First World War. Robert, perhaps you want to explain where the
Yes.
soldier had
Yes.
fought and the connections between the two.
Tommy Lloyd, who the Chelsea pensioner that the protagonist runs into in Regent Park, joined the British Army in time to be a drummer boy at Balaclava. And in fact, as he says, not only did he not was he not in the Great War, the First World War, he was pensioned off before the Second Boer War. I had a delightful time researching, how a man could be alive in 1944 that was a 10-year-old drummer boy at Balaclava, but it was chronologically possible. But the morale thing I wanted to get to was the protagonist talks about the battles he was in, and he has several medals, uh, Queen Victoria era medals. And the protagonist, Jim, says, "How did you get through all that combat, Mr. Lloyd?" And Tommy Lloyd says, "Call me Tommy. I was terrified at first, of course, but the sergeant major stands you up, don't he? Gets you busy with your job. Drum calls give orders in battle, settle the men, gives them a sense of what's regular and all that hurly-burly, the noise and the smoke." Kind of hard for me to read this part. "My drum says somebody sees, somebody knows what needs to be done." And in any talk about morale in the American Army in World War II, and I'm sure in others, you have to recognize the role of the non-commissioned officers in showing the enlisted men, the green privates, and all, in showing them what needs to be done, and in calming them down. And that's what Tommy Lloyd saw that in the 19th century, and he told that to Jim.
Well, let's take a quick break and let's come back. And actually, I think let's talk a bit more about that because I think we're sort of poking at this. Why do people do the things they do? Why do they fight and how do they organize? And just before we go on the break, we have been very lucky and we've interviewed lots of officers on this podcast. Both myself and Gareth at one time have been officers as well. But just before we go on this break, I'm going to tip my cap to Sergeant Kitchener, my grandfather, who was one of those sergeants who went across North Africa, was in Iraq, and I suspect was probably more the backbone of the army than I would ever have been as an officer in the Royal Navy. But we'll move off and we'll come back straight after this. Welcome back. Well, fascinating foray from London when the protagonist went to see Gielgud, which apparently was very good, which I understand, all the way through to the Battle of the Bulge, which I'm sure we'll come on to a little bit more in a little bit later on. But you talked about the sergeant, the Chelsea pensioner that Jim, the protagonist, met. And also you talked a bit about the Jeep show and it was sort of a 3-man unit. Talk to me a bit about that because that seems normal military units are large. There are sergeants, there's organization, there's structure. To some degree, you need to be told what you're doing. There's lots of orders. What did you learn about Jeep show and how do they make that work? I can imagine there's all sorts of challenges of getting 3 people, pretty junior, driving around giving these shows. How did that work? What did you learn? And maybe there's something that you read in the letters as well about that.
Well, I think the first thing, and relating it to, the themes of your programs, is 3 men in a Jeep is a small, agile team. So they can go get pretty much anywhere. And of course, the Jeep was the iconic American vehicle of the war. And so they could go anywhere, a small agile team anywhere on the front. They could change directions if they needed to. And they were professionals they were all entertainment professionals. So when they were able to do their job under various circumstances. And I think, you know more about this, and many of your listeners will, but jobs get done on the ground by individual people. You may have a large group in your software development group or in your sales force, but the actual work gets done by very small groups of people or even individuals. So, and they have to be, as these Jeep Show soldiers were, they have to be well trained and they have to be allowed to be flexible. They know their mission and they have to be allowed to be flexible in that. One point, jumping back to the sergeant major thing, that I would say to any, one in a large organization is, I think in civilian life, often the quote unquote sergeant majors in your organization don't get enough credit, don't have enough influence. These are the men and women that are kind of on the front. They're touching the customers, they're seeing the customers, they're working with the delivery drivers. And I think I think that many organizations would do better, the senior leadership, to allow again, I'll call them sergeant majors, allow perhaps their middle management, allow their frontline management more latitude to direct the frontline people.
If Gareth was here, he would agree vehemently and say, of course, we've done an episode on mission command. But I think your point is bang on. You used the word of mission there, and
yeah.
In the book, clearly the sort of the bulk of the story is around the Battle of the Bulge and Jim moving through the Battle of the Bulge. But there's the mission that he starts out with almost ends up not being the mission he ends with. And I as a sort of someone who's a fan of history,
yeah,
while obviously there's a vehicle for telling a story and bringing you into a character, I suspect it wasn't coincidental that this was a part of the war where all of a sudden it didn't matter what you did going into the battle, what you did coming out of the battle was very, very different. So perhaps you can talk about what happens to Jim when sort of the Germans start to advance in the Battle of the Bulge, and actually how that relates to the real world Battle of the Bulge, because you tell multiple stories that sort of bring this to life.
Well, he is, as we said earlier, he is caught up at the very front lines and stuck there on the morning of December 16th when there's a 90-minute artillery barrage from the Germans. And as it happens, he is up in the water tower in Hosingen, Luxembourg, and is actually the first one to see the first German soldier coming up. The German border was about half a mile away from Hosingen, and it was a Volksgrenadier a division that came up exactly towards Hosingen. He is no longer, as you say, at that point, he is no longer an entertainment soldier. He is a combat infantryman. The officers on the scene send him back with a captured map. They're probably thinking he may not be the most experienced infantry soldier, and we have to get this map to battalion. So let's send it with the entertainment soldier. But he goes from Hosingen to a village called Clairvaux, which was the battalion headquarters. There was a Battle of Clairvaux for 2 days during the Battle of the Bulge, and Jim, the protagonist, is there for that. He then gets sent to essentially a crossroads called Antonio Shaft, and you may follow that trail. If you follow the road to Bastogne, an American combat team was put together to basically as a delaying, just to delay the Germans on the road to Bastogne long enough for the 101st Infantry to get into Bastogne. And Jim is there. He retreats from there to Longvilly. There was indeed a battle at Longvilly, and he retreats, as many did, from there to Bastogne, where they are surrounded, and the siege of Bastogne goes on for about 6 days. So he has stopped being an entertainment soldier. He does get involved in combat duties along the way. As you might expect, he's not a hero. It's not a comic book, and he's not a hero. He has many misgivings along the way. He follows his orders, but one point I make along the way is he actually, in training camp, before he became an entertainment soldier, he became qualified on the bazooka, which was the slang term for a portable rocket launcher. The bazooka was a way to disable German tanks, and it was an extremely dangerous way to disable German tanks. And at several times along the way, an officer is saying, "Is there any soldier here qualified in the bazooka?" And Jim, kind of looks down at his shoes or takes a step backwards. But he does his duty when it's right in front of him, but he's not volunteering for anything that hazardous. So I think it's a real picture of how a real person would react under the circumstances.
And for those people who are listening who perhaps aren't massively interested in military history, so as Robert was talking about the different bits of the Battle of the Bulge, we've talked where myself and Gareth are just about to embark on a tour of the area, and so we'll I'm sure do more episodes of that. But I think what's really fascinating is that the story, whether you're interested in what the individual battles were, it was really how you've captured the panic and the all hands on deck approach. Yeah. In other words, there's a very structured organization which says you do this, you over there do that, and here's how we do this. And then all of a sudden, the book captures beautifully how all of that goes out of the window, and you are a soldier first, and you are whatever else you were before. So as you go through the story, first of all, moving from these different experiences and how Jim reacts to this, but also you meet all these other people where, well, we don't need stores people. We don't have any stores left. Right. So congratulations, you are no longer a store person. Right. You are now an infantryman, and how it moves through. In the experience, he gains a Purple Heart, which I imagine was quite important for you to write, which was almost, this is the proof, and there's discussion about a combat infantryman medal and why that's important. But the reason why that was fascinating me, first of all, was that it's obviously based in history, where I would argue for unusually everyone was considered a combat infantryman all the way through, rather than sort of the tip of the spear. But also just that sense of changing mission and how the military was very quickly able to reorganize. You talked about task group snafu, which of course, again, to be slightly nerdy, we think that the Germans were kings of Kampfgruppe. It was all about small units, loosely organized to achieve a goal, when actually it turns out the Americans were also very good at this, whether it be snafu or indeed other areas.
Team Rose,
The defense of the Allies, and particularly the Americans' defense against the Germans, wasn't because there were clearly stood up organizations dug in ready to fight. It was because there were groups of people who were rapidly organized with different experiences, different expertise to turn around and fight. So I love that, and I thought you captured that really, really well, where I knew what was going to happen and I knew the outcomes, and yet actually watching this transition from, and in fact, you have Jim say on multiple occasions, I'm just an entertainer. I think he says, I'm a four. In fact, I think what he does is I notice he repeats multiple times, I'm a 4-4-2. Guys, right. You don't want me anywhere near this. Right. And yet actually it represents that sort of evolution and the change in mission. So I thought that was really, really interesting.
There's a scene you made me think of that resonates very, very strongly with veterans I've spoken to, combat veterans. And I've spoken to many, especially of the global war on terror. But there's a scene where along the way, Jim, as you just said, is telling some sergeant, "Well, yeah, I'm a 442, and I've got an important map to deliver to Bastogne." And the sergeant looks at him and says, "Are you a man or a woman?" And he said, "Well, I'm a man." "What's that in your hand?" It said, "That's a rifle." That's You're a rifleman, Tanzer, and you're here to support your buddies, and your buddies are here to support you. And you wouldn't run down that road towards Bastogne without your buddies, would you? And Jim says, "No, I wouldn't." And after that, he is accepted by this thrown together squad in a farmhouse outside of Longville, waiting for the inevitable German attack.
Fascinating. So you've written the book. You've obviously, I know what it's like when you start writing things. You're focused on the moment, and it's only
Yeah.
later when you start to sort of say, "Huh, I didn't really realize that's what I meant." Looking back now, what are your big takeaways around morale, small team leadership,
Yeah.
and the lessons that your protagonist Jim learned along the way? What are your big takeaways?
Well, I think my biggest takeaway is the American Army, to a great extent, represented the American population as a whole. The Navy and the Marines and the Army Air Force essentially hand selected. They did not get many soldiers from the draft. American Army was much larger than those other services put together. So the Army had to depend on the draft. So the American Army, unlike these other excellent services, represented the population as a whole. So they drafted PhDs. They drafted people, who had a second grade education. I will tell you, my father did tell me there was a boy in his barracks in basic that held up his boots and said, "This is the first pair of shoes I've ever had that are all mine in my whole life." So the Army represented all of America. And like the British Army, but perhaps in an even more American way, it was an army of citizen soldiers. You know, they were kind of skeptical of their officers. They were skeptical of what they call, the bureaucracy, what is called in the American Army chicken shit. I'm sure there's a British term for it as well. Paint the flagstones outside the general's quarters, that kind of thing. And as I was saying earlier, in the end, they say they weren't really fighting for democracy. They weren't really fighting, to eradicate the Nazi scourge. They were fighting for each other. And they really didn't like it very much when they were there, but they look back on it as one of the great, if not the greatest experience of their lives. And so my biggest takeaway when it was done was, we'll never see that again. We'll never see, when my dad came home from England and resumed civilian life, he wasn't special. There were 16 million other men that were coming. 16 million other men were resuming civilian life in America at the same time. But I came away with a feeling of how special that was, how it changed America after the war. And in fact, in the sequel, I'm going to drag Jim through the GI Bill and send him to some elite university. Even though he, like my dad, he has a blue collar background. So my biggest takeaway was a huge respect for the citizen soldiers of the American Army, and how they changed America, how the Army changed them, and then how they changed America, over the next 30 or 40 years.
You First of all, I think you're exactly right, but isn't it? We've endlessly, week after week, we talk about great leadership, and we
Yeah.
talk about high performing teams, and we use all of these sort of leadership mumbo jumbo, you
Yes,
might
yes.
say. But what I think is really important is that the US citizen army, along with the British citizen army, was hugely successful. A group of people who, frankly, could easily ask why they were stuck in the middle of a forest in Luxembourg or Belgium, and yet they were successful. A group of people in this book, but obviously in real life, who saw 10 times the number of troops than their units had. And this was particularly for the Battle of the Bulge. The numbers that the Germans had assembled compared to the numbers that the US had was massive, who could easily have said, no, thank you very much. This is not what I signed up for. And by the way, this was a group of people who were told the war's going to be over soon.
By Christmas, yes.
This was a group of people who, and I can't remember if this is in your book or another book I've been reading recently, who would witness the Germans fishing in the river, and the agreement was not to fight with them. If you don't shoot at us, we don't shoot at them. These were people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And yet, for the reasons you've talked about, the importance of morale,
Yeah.
the importance of small team working together, the importance of fighting for your friends, the importance of the NCOs to pull them together, and often in these actions in the Ardennes, it was an NCO that was leading these actions, obviously, because there was no one else.
Yeah.
I think there's something remarkable there, and this is, Robert, I know you've listened to a couple of our episodes, but this is one of my big things, which is, I think there are lots of people who would say sending people out on jeeps, giving this show, well, that's just a bit of hippie mumbo jumbo. We don't need to do that. That seems like a waste of energy. That's 3 more rifles on the line. Why would you do it? Actually, all of these things matter and make a difference. And it leads us back to the conversation we had about showing up as morale.
Right.
I think your point is that had a disproportionate impact on a group of people, whether it was Mickey Rooney or someone they didn't know. The fact that a jeep turned up, said, we haven't forgotten you. I think there's a lot in there, and it's difficult sometimes in the big story to pull those things out, but it is not hippie mumbo jumbo. The numbers and the history speaks for itself in terms of the ability to stop the Germans with overwhelming firepower coming against them. It wasn't by accident. It was because of all these things coming together.
Well, and Napoleon said, morale is to the material as 3 is to 1. And, I find that true. In the southern U.S., they say it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And I think leaders of organizations often fail to think through the effect of strategic level decisions on the morale, or you could call it the enthusiasm, of their frontline employees, of the employees actually executing it. And there should be jeep shows in large organizations.
Well, there's an interesting question. What would a jeep show in a large organization look like? We'll leave that for the listener to think about. But I think your point is, and that is a really important one, which is, I think we assume that morale is things that people on the front line of a military unit care about, as opposed to the people we work with every day. Maybe that's a good place for us to finish for tonight. Robert, thank you so much. Again, it's another one of these, you never quite know what you're going to tease out of these conversations. It's a really great read. I recommend everyone, Jeep Show by Robert O'Connor. If you go onto Amazon, if you're in the UK and no doubt in the US. Robert, tell us, if people want to learn more about you, or in fact go find your previous books, where can they find you? How can they get hold of you?
Thanks for asking. I have a website called jeepshowbook.com, and it has all that information on it. It has photographs of jeep shows and other things. And it has one last thing. I created a character in the book called the War Correspondent. And in the book, he actually was the entertainment reporter for the New York Times. I made this up, of course, out of whole cloth. But he then is a war correspondent. And his function in the book, in the story, is to explain the 30,000-foot view to Private Jim Tanzer, so that the readers can understand the big picture about the defense of Bastogne without having to wade through very boring exposition. You always want a character that either needs everything explained to him or explains everything. Well, I got very inspired by this idea of the U.S. Army after the war, and I learned a lot about Europe in the first year or two after the war and the mass migrations and the chaos. And I sat down and wrote a column that theoretically this war correspondent wrote after the war, looking back on the war and the American Army. And it's the best thing I wrote in the whole book. My editor made me take it out of the book because, and she's a very good editor. She said, you have to end with your protagonist in, in such and such a place doing such and such a thing. And I said, okay, you're the boss on editing. I put it on the website, and I would love any of your listeners that are interested in a view from mid 1946 of an experienced war correspondent on what's going on in Europe and the American Army in World War II. I point you to that on the website. It's worth the visit in itself.
I think you should, in the next edition, you should put that in the epilogue.
I
And
know. I know.
I've just finished reading the book, and so now I need to go and read
Yes.
that just to sort of
Yes.
finish off the experience. Well, look, Robert, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's so interesting when we have these different perspectives. This is a work of historical fiction, but actually, I think whether fiction or fact, actually the underlying messages, as well as a great story and a rip-roaring read, as well as someone who's, for me, one of the things that was most interesting was I know a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge, and either before this episode or after this episode, we're probably going to do some more episodes because myself and Gareth are doing another road trip. So you'll either already heard that road trip or you'll hear a bit of that road trip afterwards. So we're currently reading lots of books about this unit, this village. What I don't think has been done before, at least I've not read that before, is to turn that on its head and say, what if you don't know anything about the military units? What if you don't know anything about the direction of travel or the goal? What if you were the person on the ground who just happened to be there when all of a sudden he says, that's interesting, there's lots of points of light over there. What does that mean? And everyone else goes, get down. That means they're about what? So I really enjoyed seeing the history of the Battle of the Bulge through the eyes of someone on the ground. And as you pointed out at the beginning, actually very historically accurate. I was ticking off in my mind all the pieces of history that you wove into there. So I would recommend people who haven't read it before, Jeep Show by Robert O'Connor, please do go onto the website, learn a bit more, and please let Robert know what you think about his book. I think feedback is always great. I was reading some of the frankly very complimentary responses on Amazon and reviews on Amazon, so please do go that. That I think is all for today. If Gareth were here, he would thank you. Having messaged him just before we started, I think he's got a couple more hours of work in him. So unfortunately, he isn't able to join us this evening. If you have enjoyed this, please remember to subscribe. We have done many episodes, and as I think is now, we need to get a t-shirt saying this, many of the topics we've talked about today, we've done bigger episodes, whether it be mission command, a little bit about morale. I think we need to do a bit more about morale. Small unit teams, there's lots of episodes, these different examples. I mean, just when we talk about small teams, we had an ex-US cavalryman talk about his life in a tank and what that meant and how it worked. So go listen to that if that's interesting and you want to learn a bit more. If this is the first time you have listened to an episode of Battling with Business, please tell your friends. Myself and Gareth avidly look at our downloads because apparently if you create a podcast, you are doomed to do that frequently. But we'd love to build the group of people. And if there are people you think we should have on the show because you think they've got an interesting angle, whether it's the next general we should invite on the show, we've been very lucky we've had a number of those kinds of folks, or whether it's someone that we wouldn't necessarily expect to bring on the show. And I think Robert's a really great example of someone who's written some fiction but has these interesting insights and is fascinated by these ideas. Please do let us know. We're on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We are on Battling with Biz both on Twitter and on Blue Sky. And we're on LinkedIn, or at least we post on our real names under LinkedIn. So please do come and find us. For now, though, thank you very much for joining us. And Robert, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking about Jim and his adventures in Jeep Show. But for now, we'll say thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Battling with Business.